April 3rd, 1882. A single shot from behind. America's most famous outlaw fell, and with him, a legend was born. Or was it? For over a century, whispers echoed through American history. What if Jesse James never died that day? What if the man in the grave wasn't him at all? The question haunted historians, fascinated conspiracy theorists, and tormented the James family for generations. Then, in 1995, science offered what history could not, a chance to excavate not just a grave, but the truth itself. What researchers found would shock the world and finally answer the question that had lingered for 113 years. This is the story of how DNA testing revealed the stunning truth about Jesse James. To understand why this mystery captivated America for so long, you need to understand who Jesse James was and why his death seemed almost too convenient, too perfectly timed. Jesse Woodson James wasn't born an outlaw. He was born on September 5, 1847, in Clay County, Missouri, to a reasonably respectable family. His father, Robert James, was a Baptist minister who also farmed hemp, a common crop in Missouri at the time. His mother, Zerelda, was known for her fierce temperament and unwavering loyalty to her children, traits that would define her role in the legend that was to come. The James family farm was modest but productive, located in a region that would soon become one of the most contested areas in American history. Missouri was a border state, sitting right on the line between North and South, between free and slave states, between two visions of what America should be. When Jesse was just 4 years old, his father left for the California gold rush, hoping to make money by ministering to gold seekers. Robert James died there, probably of cholera, leaving Zerelda to raise Jesse, his older brother Frank, and his younger sister Susan alone. Zerelda remarried twice. Her second husband was a man who didn't treat the children well and left quickly. Her third husband, Dr. Reuben Samuel, was a quiet, gentle man who gave the children stability, though by all accounts, he was dominated by the strong-willed Zerelda. The farm where they lived would later become famous, a place of pilgrimage for those fascinated by outlaw history. Jesse grew up during one of the most turbulent periods in American history. By the time he was 14, the Civil War had begun, and Missouri became a battlefield. Unlike states that clearly sided with the Union or Confederacy, Missouri was split, with neighbor fighting neighbor, brother fighting brother. The violence was intimate and brutal. This wasn't war conducted by distant armies on formal battlefields. This was guerrilla warfare, raids and reprisals, atrocities committed by both sides in a cycle of revenge that seemed to have no end. The James family sided with the Confederacy, like many in their region. When federal soldiers came to the farm looking for information about Confederate guerrillas, they treated the family harshly. According to family accounts, they tortured Dr. Samuel and beat young Jesse, trying to force them to reveal the whereabouts of Frank James, who had already joined a guerrilla unit. These experiences radicalized Jesse. At 15, he joined up with one of the most notorious guerrilla leaders in Missouri, Bloody Bill Anderson. Anderson's unit wasn't part of the regular Confederate Army. They operated independently, conducting raids on Union forces, attacking towns with Union sympathies, and creating terror throughout the region. The violence was shocking, even by Civil War standards. Jesse participated in these raids, learning to shoot with deadly accuracy, to move quickly and strike without warning, to show no mercy to enemies. He witnessed and participated in acts that would haunt the region for generations. The most infamous of these was the Centralia Massacre in September 1864. Anderson's guerrillas stopped a train, robbed the passengers, and then executed 24 unarmed Union soldiers who were on leave and traveling home. When Union forces pursued Anderson's band, the guerrillas ambushed them, killing over 100 soldiers in a brief, brutal fight. Jesse James, 17 years old at the time, was there. He killed men that day. The experience marked him permanently. When the Civil War ended in April 1865 with Confederate surrender, many guerrilla fighters found themselves in an impossible position. They were young men trained in violence, marked as Confederate irregulars, and living in a Missouri now controlled by Union forces and Reconstruction policies. Many of them had committed acts during the war that would be considered war crimes. They couldn't simply go home and take up farming. They were watched, suspected, and in some cases, actively persecuted. Jesse, along with his brother Frank and several other former guerrillas, made a choice that would define the rest of his life. If he couldn't find peace in the post-war world, he would continue the war by other means. He would become an outlaw, striking at the institutions and forces he blamed for destroying his South, his way of life, his youth. The first major robbery attributed to the James Younger Gang occurred on February 13, 1866, when armed men rode into Liberty, Missouri, and robbed the Clay County Savings Association of approximately $60,000. It was brazen, conducted in broad daylight with military precision. During the escape, a bystander was shot and killed, making it not just theft, but deadly violence. Whether Jesse participated in this specific robbery is debated by historians, but it established a pattern that would continue for the next 16 years. The gang expanded and evolved. Besides Jesse and Frank James, it included the younger brothers, Cole, Jim, John, and Bob, along with various other former guerrillas and Confederate sympathizers. They robbed banks across Missouri, Kentucky, Iowa, and other states. They developed tactics that showed their guerrilla training: quick strikes, multiple escape routes, intimidation of witnesses, and disappearing into the countryside where local sympathizers might shelter them. But what made Jesse James different from other outlaws of his era, what elevated him from common criminal to legendary figure, was his relationship with the press. Jesse understood something that few criminals of his time grasped: the power of controlling his own narrative. He reached out to John Newman Edwards, editor of the Kansas City Times and a former Confederate officer who viewed Jesse sympathetically. Edwards began writing articles that portrayed Jesse and his gang not as criminals, but as Confederate heroes driven to outlawry by an unjust occupation. According to these romanticized accounts, Jesse only robbed from the rich railroad companies and banks, institutions associated with Northern capital and Reconstruction policies that many Missourians resented. The stories claimed Jesse gave money to poor farmers, helped widows keep their farms, and stood up for common people against oppressive institutions. The reality was far more complex and far less noble. Jesse robbed banks and trains, but there's little verified evidence he gave much to the poor. He kept most of his stolen money, lived comfortably when not on the run, and used the proceeds to fund his outlaw lifestyle. But the myth was powerful, and many people, especially in rural Missouri and other former Confederate areas, chose to believe it. Jesse became a folk hero, a symbol of Southern resistance, a man who refused to accept defeat even when the Confederacy had fallen. The gang's robberies grew bolder. In 1873, they conducted what's believed to be the first train robbery in the American West, when they derailed a Rock Island Express train in Iowa, robbed the passengers, and made off with several $1,000s. This innovation would be copied by outlaws throughout the West for decades to come. The robbery captured public imagination. It was dramatic, daring, and seemed to strike at the powerful railroad companies that many small farmers viewed as exploitative. But not everyone saw Jesse as a hero. To many, especially in areas that had supported the Union, he was simply a criminal, a murderer, and a thief who used politics and the lost cause of the Confederacy as an excuse for his crimes. Banks and railroad companies began offering substantial rewards for his capture. The Pinkerton Detective Agency, America's most famous private security firm, was hired to track him down. The Pinkertons' pursuit of Jesse led to one of the darkest episodes in the entire saga. On January 26, 1875, Pinkerton agents surrounded the James family farm, believing Jesse and Frank were hiding there. They threw a device into the house. Accounts differ on whether it was intended as a smoke bomb or an incendiary device, but it exploded, killing Jesse's 9-year-old half-brother Archie and severely injuring Zerelda, who lost most of her right arm to the blast. Neither Jesse nor Frank had been in the house. The attack on their family home, especially the death of a child and the maiming of their mother, generated enormous sympathy for the James brothers, even among people who'd previously viewed them as criminals. The Pinkertons were widely criticized, and Jesse used the incident in his letters to newspapers, portraying himself as a man defending his family against ruthless enemies. Public opinion in Missouri shifted even further in his favor. The gang's most famous robbery attempt was also their greatest disaster. In September 1876, they rode into Northfield, Minnesota, intending to rob the First National Bank. But Northfield was far from friendly Missouri, and the townspeople had no sympathy for former Confederates. When the gang entered the bank, an employee refused to open the safe, even at gunpoint. Shots were fired inside the bank, and the sound brought armed townspeople running. What followed was chaos. The townspeople grabbed rifles and shotguns from a nearby hardware store and opened fire on the gang members holding their horses outside. In the resulting battle, 2 gang members were killed in the street. Inside the bank, another gang member had shot and killed the cashier, who'd refused to cooperate. The remaining gang members fled in panic, riding out of town under heavy fire from citizens positioned at windows and rooftops. The manhunt that followed was massive. Hundreds of men combed the Minnesota countryside looking for the fleeing outlaws. Within 2 weeks, the 3 younger brothers had been captured, all badly wounded. Bob Younger had been shot 11 times, but survived. The Youngers went to prison in Minnesota, where they would remain for 25 years. 2 other gang members were shot and killed during the pursuit. Only Jesse and Frank made it back to Missouri, traveling hundreds of miles on foot and by stolen horses, evading capture through a combination of luck, skill, and desperate audacity. After Northfield, the James Younger gang was finished. Most members were dead or in prison. Jesse and Frank went into hiding, living under assumed names in Tennessee, trying to stay out of sight. For about 3 years, they maintained a relatively quiet life. Jesse married his first cousin, Zerelda, called Z, and they had 2 children. But Jesse was restless, and he was running out of money. By 1879, Jesse had formed a new gang, recruiting younger men with less experience and, crucially, less loyalty than his former comrades. These new gang members didn't have the shared experiences of guerrilla warfare, didn't have the same bonds of trust, didn't have the same reasons to risk their lives for Jesse James. This would prove fatal to Jesse, though he didn't seem to recognize the danger. The new gang conducted several robberies in 1879 and 1880, but they were sloppier, more violent, and less successful than the old operations. A train robbery in Glendale, Missouri netted about $6,000, but killed several people unnecessarily, turning public opinion against Jesse, even in Missouri. Another train robbery near Muscle Shoals, Alabama, was poorly planned and generated little money. The law was closing in, and Jesse's options were narrowing. In late 1881, Jesse moved to St. Joseph, Missouri, living under the name Thomas Howard. He rented a small house on a hill at 1318 Lafayette Street with Z and their 2 young children, Jesse Edward and Mary Susan. He grew a beard to disguise his appearance and claimed to be a cattle buyer, though neighbors noted he seemed to have no regular employment and his business trips were irregular and mysterious. Among his new gang members were 2 brothers from Ray County, Missouri, Charlie and Robert Ford. Bob Ford was just 20 years old, ambitious, eager to make something of himself, but with no clear path to prosperity. The Fords came from poverty, and Bob in particular seemed to resent his circumstances. When he heard about the substantial rewards offered for Jesse James, $5,000 dead, $10,000 alive, he saw an opportunity to change his life completely. Missouri Governor Thomas Crittenden was determined to end Jesse's outlaw career. The robberies were making Missouri look lawless and dangerous, scaring away investment and giving the state a bad reputation. Crittenden had increased the rewards for Jesse's capture and made it known he would protect anyone who helped bring the outlaw in. Bob Ford made contact with law enforcement officials and worked out a deal. He would get close to Jesse, gain his trust, and when the opportunity presented itself, he would act. The opportunity came on April 3, 1882. It was a Monday morning, warm for early April. Jesse, Bob, and Charlie Ford were at the house on Lafayette Street, planning another robbery. Some accounts say Jesse was preparing to leave town, moving to another location to stay ahead of the law. But first, he decided to tidy up the house. This is where the story takes on an almost mythical quality, repeated so many times it's hard to separate fact from embellishment. Jesse, according to multiple accounts, removed his gun belt. This was extraordinary. Jesse was known for always being armed, for never letting his guard down. But on this warm morning, he took off his guns. Some say the heat made the gun belt uncomfortable. Others claim he was going to clean a picture frame or dust the wall and didn't want the guns in the way. Whatever the reason, Jesse turned his back on Bob Ford. He stepped onto a chair to reach a picture frame on the wall. And Bob saw his chance. He drew his revolver, aimed carefully, and fired a single shot. The bullet entered the back of Jesse's head just behind his right ear, traveled through his brain, and exited through his forehead. Jesse fell from the chair to the floor. He was dead or dying instantly, killed at age 34 by a young man he'd trusted in the home where his wife and children lived, shot from behind without warning. Bob Ford immediately rushed out of the house, ran to the telegraph office, and sent messages to Governor Crittenden and law enforcement officials. His message was brief and direct. "I have killed Jesse James, Bob Ford." Within hours, the news was spreading across Missouri and then across the nation. Jesse James, America's most famous outlaw, was dead. Authorities and journalists descended on St. Joseph. The body was examined by doctors and positively identified by multiple witnesses. Jesse's mother, Zerelda, made the journey from Kearney, viewed the body, and confirmed it was her son. Frank James's wife also identified the body. So did several others who had known Jesse personally. Photographs were taken of the body, a common practice in that era for notorious criminals, showing Jesse laid out on a cooling board, the bullet wound clearly visible in his forehead, his face surprisingly peaceful in death despite the violence of his dying. The body was put on public display at a local undertaker's establishment, and thousands of people came to view it. Some came out of curiosity, wanting to see the famous outlaw in death. Others came to verify the identification for themselves, not quite believing that Jesse James could really be dead. Still, others came to pay respects, viewing him as a hero who'd been murdered by a traitor. Bob Ford expected to be celebrated as the man who'd ended Jesse's reign of terror. Instead, he found himself reviled. The myth of Jesse James as a Confederate hero and Robin Hood figure was so powerful that many people viewed Ford not as a brave lawman's ally, but as a coward and a backstabber who'd murdered an unarmed man for money. Popular sentiment turned against him with surprising speed and intensity. A song was written almost immediately, The Ballad of Jesse James, with a refrain that captured public opinion. "That dirty little coward that shot Mr. Howard has laid poor Jesse in his grave." The song spread rapidly, becoming one of the most famous American folk songs. Bob Ford would be forever known as that dirty little coward, his name synonymous with treachery and cowardice. Ford did collect his reward money, though he had to split it with his brother Charlie and with law enforcement officials, leaving him with less than he'd expected. He tried various occupations, moving from place to place, always haunted by what he'd done and how he was perceived. He couldn't escape his reputation. Wherever he went, people knew him as Jesse James's killer, and more often than not, they despised him for it. Jesse's body was taken back to Kearney, to the family farm where he'd grown up. Zerelda insisted on burying him on the property, right outside the kitchen window, where she could see his grave and, as she said, watch over him in death as she hadn't been able to in life. She was afraid that if he was buried in a public cemetery, grave robbers or souvenir hunters would disturb his rest. The burial took place on April 6, 1882, with a large crowd attending, many of them sympathizers who viewed Jesse as a hero. Bob Ford's story had a grim ending. For 10 years he lived with his reputation, drifting from town to town, trying various business ventures, none successful. He opened a saloon in Creede, Colorado, but even there he couldn't escape his past. On June 8, 1892, a man named Edward O'Kelly walked into Ford's saloon and shot him in the throat with a shotgun, killing him instantly. O'Kelly claimed he did it to avenge Jesse James, though his real motivations were probably more complex, a mixture of seeking fame, possible mental instability, and personal grievances against Ford. The irony wasn't lost on observers. Bob Ford had lived for 10 years with the reputation of having shot an unarmed man in the back, and he died in exactly the same way, shot from behind without warning. O'Kelly served a short prison sentence for the killing, just 10 years, despite it being a clear case of premeditated murder. Public sympathy for Ford was so low that even his killer received relatively lenient treatment. Frank James outlived everyone involved in the story. After Jesse's death, Frank negotiated a surrender with Missouri authorities. He stood trial for various crimes, but was acquitted, largely because witnesses refused to testify against him, or because juries in Missouri were sympathetic to his Confederate background. He lived until 1915, dying at age 72 of natural causes. In his later years, he gave tours of the old James farm, appeared at county fairs and Wild West shows, living off the fame of his outlaw past while maintaining a veneer of respectability. Zerelda James Samuel lived until 1911, fiercely defending her son's reputations until her death. She charged admission for people to visit Jesse's grave, selling pebbles from around the burial site as souvenirs. She gave interviews to journalists, always portraying Jesse as a victim of circumstance, a good boy driven to outlawry by persecution and injustice. Her version of the story, romanticized and sanitized, contributed significantly to the Jesse James legend. Jesse's burial on the family farm should have been the end of the story, but almost immediately, rumors began circulating. Some claimed the body shown in St. Joseph hadn't looked quite right. The height seemed off, or the scars didn't match what people remembered. Others insisted they'd seen Jesse alive after April 1882. These whispers and rumors grew over the years, fed by the natural tendency of legends to persist and by people's reluctance to believe that such a famous figure could die in such an ordinary way. As decades passed, the rumors evolved into elaborate conspiracy theories. Perhaps Jesse had faked his death, arranging for a substitute to be shot in his place. Perhaps Bob Ford had been in on the deception, firing a staged shot while Jesse escaped. Perhaps the man in the Kearney grave was someone else entirely, a gang member who resembled Jesse, or a drifter recruited specifically for the purpose. These theories had no real evidence behind them, but they persisted nonetheless. Then, in 1948, 66 years after Jesse's supposed death, an elderly man named J. Frank Dalton began claiming he was the real Jesse James. Dalton's story was extraordinary. According to him, the man shot in St. Joseph had been a substitute, possibly a gang member named Charlie Bigelow who resembled Jesse. The real Jesse James had escaped, fled to Texas, and lived there under various assumed names for the next 6 decades, watching from a distance as his legend grew. Dalton was a compelling figure in some ways. He was old enough to be Jesse James if Jesse had survived. Dalton claimed to have been born in 1848, just a year after Jesse's verified birth year. He knew details about Jesse's life that seemed too specific to be coincidence or easily researched. He could describe the layouts of buildings involved in famous robberies, recall conversations with gang members, and identify people in old photographs. He had physical evidence, too, scars from old gunshot wounds that appeared consistent with Jesse's documented injuries, including being shot multiple times during his outlaw career. Most notably, Dalton was missing part of the tip of his left middle finger, and historical accounts confirmed that Jesse James had the same distinctive injury. How could Dalton have known about this detail, unless he really was Jesse? Skeptics pointed out that the finger injury had been mentioned in some published accounts of Jesse's life, so Dalton could have learned about it and deliberately injured his own finger to match. But Dalton's supporters found this explanation implausible. Would someone really mutilate their own hand to support a false claim? Dalton attracted significant media attention. He appeared on radio programs, gave interviews to newspapers across the country, and met with several people who claimed to have known Jesse James in the old days. Some of these witnesses supported his claim, saying they recognized him. Others were skeptical, noting that 66 years was a long time and that elderly memory could be unreliable. The controversy divided public opinion sharply. Some historians and journalists investigated Dalton's claims seriously, trying to verify or disprove his story. They found inconsistencies. Dalton's accounts of specific events sometimes contradicted known historical facts. His memory seemed selective, remarkably detailed about some things, conveniently vague about others. Birth records suggested Dalton had been born in 1848 and had lived his entire life in Texas and Oklahoma, never in Missouri during the Civil War era. But birth records from that period were often incomplete or inaccurate, so this wasn't conclusive proof against him. The controversy intensified when Dalton appeared before a notary in 1948 and made a formal declaration that he was Jesse Woodson James. He recounted his life story in detail, describing how he'd supposedly faked his death and lived in hiding. He claimed he'd kept silent for so long because he feared prosecution. But now that he was old and near death, he wanted to set the record straight and reclaim his true identity. Dalton died in 1951 at the claimed age of 103, still insisting he was Jesse James. His death certificate listed his name as J. Frank Dalton, alias Jesse James, acknowledging his claim without necessarily endorsing it. He was buried in Granbury, Texas, and his grave marker identified him as Jesse James. But for many people, the question remained unresolved. Was Dalton really Jesse James, or was he an old man seeking attention with an elaborate hoax? The James family in Missouri maintained that their ancestor had died in 1882 and was buried where they'd always said he was buried. But without any way to definitively prove it, the controversy continued. Other claimants emerged over the years. Several other men came forward claiming to be Jesse James, though none attracted as much attention as Dalton. Each new claim added another layer to the mystery, another reason to question whether the conventional history was actually true. In 1902, Jesse's body had been moved from the family farm to Mount Olivet Cemetery in Kearney. Zerelda had initially buried him on the property where she could watch over him, but eventually the family decided a cemetery would be more appropriate and more secure. The move was conducted with witnesses present, and those witnesses confirmed that the body being transferred was indeed from Jesse's original grave. But for conspiracy theorists, this move introduced another potential point of confusion or substitution. By the 1990s, DNA testing had revolutionized forensic science and criminal justice. The technique had been used successfully to solve contemporary crimes, to exonerate wrongly convicted people, and to identify victims of disasters. Forensic scientists realized they could apply the same techniques to historical questions. If they could extract DNA from old remains and compare it to DNA from known descendants, they could definitively identify historical figures and resolve long-standing controversies. Professor James Starrs, a forensic scientist at George Washington University, had already gained recognition for applying modern forensic techniques to historical mysteries. He'd investigated the death of Meriwether Lewis of Lewis and Clark fame, conducting an exhumation and forensic analysis that shed new light on whether Lewis had committed suicide or been murdered. Starrs saw the Jesse James case as another ideal candidate for scientific investigation. The science was straightforward in principle. DNA testing could compare genetic material from the remains in the Kearney grave with DNA from verified descendants of Jesse James. If the DNA matched, it would prove the grave contained Jesse. If it didn't match, it would suggest Jesse had indeed escaped and someone else had been buried in his place. The test would finally answer a question that had lingered for over a century. But actually conducting such a test required overcoming several obstacles. First, they needed permission to exhume the grave from Jesse's descendants, from the cemetery, and from the courts. This wasn't automatic. Many people viewed grave disturbances as disrespectful, regardless of the scientific justification. Some James family members opposed the exhumation, feeling that their ancestor deserved to rest in peace, regardless of what mysteries remained about his identity. Second, they needed funding. DNA testing in the 1990s was expensive, especially for historical cases where the samples would be degraded and difficult to work with. Historical investigations received no government funding, so money had to be raised from private sources. Third, they needed to identify appropriate descendants for comparison. The most reliable comparison would use mitochondrial DNA, which passes from mother to child essentially unchanged across generations. Mitochondrial DNA, or mtDNA, is found not in the cell nucleus, but in the mitochondria, tiny power-generating structures within cells. Unlike nuclear DNA, which comes from both parents and recombines in each generation, mtDNA passes only through the maternal line. Jesse James received his mtDNA from his mother Zerelda, and it would be identical to the mtDNA of his siblings and of all descendants through the female line. Jesse had 2 children who survived to adulthood: Jesse Edward James, born in 1875, and Mary Susan James, born in 1879. Jesse Edward had 4 daughters, and Mary also had children. Researchers began the painstaking work of tracing the family tree, looking for living descendants in the direct female line from Zerelda James. They needed to find people whose mtDNA would definitely match Jesse's if he was really Jesse's descendant. The genealogical research took months. Researchers worked through census records, birth certificates, marriage records, and family Bibles, tracking the female lineage forward through time. Eventually, they identified several living descendants through Jesse's sister, Susan James Palmer. Susan had children who had children, creating a clear maternal lineage that could be traced to living people willing to participate in the study. 2 descendants agreed to provide blood samples: Judge James R. Ross and Mark Nichols, both great-great-grandsons of Susan James Palmer. Their mtDNA was extracted and sequenced, establishing a reference profile for the James family. This profile represented the mtDNA that Zerelda James had passed to all her children, including Jesse. If the remains in the Kearney grave really were Jesse's, they should carry this exact same mtDNA sequence. Getting permission to exhume the grave took years of legal proceedings and negotiations with the James family. Some family members supported the investigation, eager to finally put the conspiracy theories to rest. Others opposed it, feeling it was disrespectful to disturb their ancestors' grave for the sake of satisfying curiosity. Eventually, enough family members agreed, and the necessary legal permissions were obtained. The exhumation was scheduled for July 1995. On the appointed day, a crowd gathered at Mount Olivet Cemetery in Kearney. Family members were present, along with Professor Stars and his team of forensic experts, journalists, camera crews, and curious onlookers. The atmosphere was tense with anticipation. After 113 years, they were about to open Jesse James's grave and see what was really inside. Workers carefully removed the soil above the burial site. When they reached the coffin, they found it had deteriorated significantly, as expected after more than a century underground. Wooden coffins don't preserve well, and this one had partially collapsed. But when they opened what remained, there were indeed skeletal remains inside, along with some fragments of clothing and other materials. The first step was a thorough forensic examination before any samples were taken for DNA testing. Forensic anthropologists carefully studied the bones, measuring them, noting any distinctive features, looking for signs of old injuries. What they found was immediately significant. The skeleton showed evidence of multiple old wounds, consistent with Jesse James's documented history of being shot multiple times during his outlaw career. There were marks on bones where bullets had struck or passed nearby. The ribs showed old fractures consistent with being thrown from a horse or injured in a fight. The teeth, remarkably well preserved, matched descriptions from 1882 accounts. But most dramatically, the skull showed a clear bullet wound, an entry point at the back of the head, an exit point at the front. This matched exactly how Bob Ford had reportedly shot Jesse, from behind, with the bullet traveling through the skull from back to front. This physical evidence was compelling even before DNA testing. The forensic anthropologists determined that the skeleton was that of a man who died in his early to mid-30s, consistent with Jesse's age at death. The height estimated from the bones matched Jesse's known height. The bone structure was consistent with a man of European descent, matching Jesse's ancestry. And the gunshot wound through the skull matched the killing shot described in 1882. Everything pointed to this being Jesse James. But physical evidence, however compelling, wasn't absolute proof. They needed the DNA results. Samples were carefully collected from teeth and from the thigh bone, which tends to preserve DNA better than other bones. These samples were divided and sent to 2 different laboratories, one at the Armed Forces DNA Identification Laboratory and another at a private facility, to ensure the results could be independently verified. The testing process would take months. DNA extraction from century-old bones is challenging. The DNA degrades over time, breaking into fragments. Environmental factors like moisture, temperature fluctuations, and microorganisms further damage the genetic material. The scientists had to use specialized techniques to extract whatever DNA remained and then amplify it using polymerase chain reaction, or PCR, which makes millions of copies of DNA fragments for analysis. While waiting for the DNA results, researchers also tested other samples related to Jesse James. There were fragments of hair that had been cut from Jesse's body in 1882 and preserved as keepsakes by family members. These hair samples were located and tested as well, providing another potential source of Jesse's DNA for comparison. Testing hair and bone from different sources would give multiple independent confirmations if the results matched. The months of waiting were tense for everyone involved. The James family was anxious, hoping the tests would confirm what they'd always maintained, that their ancestor was buried where they said he was. Historians were eager to finally resolve a long-standing controversy. The general public, fascinated by the mystery, followed news coverage and awaited the verdict. Finally, in early 1996, the results came back from both laboratories. The findings were remarkably clear and consistent. The mitochondrial DNA extracted from the skeletal remains in the Kearney grave matched the reference samples from Jesse's descendants with a probability of 99.7%. This wasn't just a possible match or a likely match, it was as close to absolute certainty as forensic science could provide. The remains were indeed those of someone from Zerelda James's direct maternal line. Given all the historical documentation, the physical evidence from the bones, and the circumstances of the burial, there was no reasonable alternative explanation. The body in the Kearney grave was Jesse Woodson James. He had died on April 3, 1882, exactly as the historical record indicated. He had not faked his death. He had not lived on in hiding. He was exactly where he was supposed to be. The announcement made international headlines. Major newspapers, television networks, and radio stations across America and around the world reported the findings. After 113 years of speculation, conspiracy theories, and false claims by imposters like J. Frank Dalton, science had provided a definitive answer. Jesse James was dead and had been since 1882. For the James family, the confirmation brought a deep sense of vindication and closure. They'd maintained for over a century that their ancestor was buried in Kearney, and now they had scientific proof. They arranged for the remains to be reburied with a proper ceremony that acknowledged both the confirmation of identity and the historical significance of the moment. Family members who doubted the conspiracy theories felt relieved. Those who'd wondered now had their answer. But what about J. Frank Dalton and his claim to be Jesse James? The DNA results from the Kearney grave effectively disproved Dalton's entire story. If Jesse was in the Kearney grave, he couldn't also have been J. Frank Dalton living in Texas. Logic alone settled the question. But some researchers wanted more direct proof, wanted to definitively show that Dalton was not Jesse James, rather than simply inferring it from the Kearney results. With permission from Dalton's descendants, researchers obtained authorization to exhume Dalton's grave in Granbury, Texas. The exhumation took place with less fanfare than the Jesse James exhumation had generated. By this point, with the Kearney results already public, most people accepted that Dalton had been either a deliberate fraud or a confused old man, but not Jesse James. Samples were collected from Dalton's remains and sent for DNA testing. The results confirmed what logic had already indicated. J. Frank Dalton's DNA bore absolutely no relation to the James family. He was not Jesse James. He was not even a distant relative. He was simply an old man named J. Frank Dalton who, for reasons that would never be fully understood, had claimed to be America's most famous outlaw. Why had Dalton done it? Psychologists and historians have offered various theories. Perhaps he genuinely believed his own story. False memory syndrome is a well-documented phenomenon where people genuinely believe events that never happened, especially if they've told and retold the stories over many years. Dalton might have started with smaller exaggerations, claiming he'd known Jesse James or had ridden with outlaws. And gradually, the embellishments grew until he believed he was Jesse himself. Alternatively, Dalton might have been more cynical and calculating. In the late 1940s, his claim brought him fame and attention he'd probably never experienced before. People were interested in him, wanted to interview him, wanted to hear his stories. For an old man who may have felt invisible and forgotten, this attention could be powerfully addictive. Walking away from the claim would mean returning to obscurity, so he maintained it even if he privately knew it wasn't true. A third possibility involves mental health issues. Some elderly people develop conditions that affect memory and cognition, including conditions that can cause delusions or confabulation, the production of false memories without conscious intention to deceive. Dalton might have suffered from such a condition, genuinely unable to distinguish between his real memories and the false memories he created around being Jesse James. Whatever Dalton's motivations, his case serves as a reminder of how powerful legends can be and how they can shape people's beliefs and even their sense of identity. Jesse James had been dead for 66 years when Dalton made his claim, yet people were still invested enough in the legend to believe it was possible Jesse had faked his death and lived on in secret. They wanted to believe the outlaw had outsmarted everyone one final time, had gotten away with the perfect crime, escaping his own death. The DNA testing didn't just identify bodies. It also revealed something profound about our relationship with history and mythology. We often prefer romantic legends to mundane truths. The idea of Jesse James living to old age under an assumed name, carrying his secret to the grave, is more exciting than the reality that he was shot in the back of the head by a young man seeking reward money, dying in a rented house at 34, his outlaw career ending not with a dramatic shootout, but with a single bullet fired from behind while his back was turned. Yet even knowing the scientific truth doesn't entirely dispel the legend. Jesse James remains one of America's most famous outlaws, the subject of countless books, films, songs, and television shows. The confirmed fact of his death in 1882 doesn't diminish the mythology that's built up around him. If anything, the DNA testing has added another layer to the story. Now we can talk not just about Jesse James the outlaw, but about the century-long mystery of whether he really died and how modern science finally solved it. The James Farm in Kearney is now a museum, and Jesse's grave at Mount Olivet Cemetery attracts thousands of visitors each year. The museum presents his life honestly, neither excusing his crimes nor denying the complex social and political context in which he operated. It acknowledges that he was both a product of his turbulent time and someone who made choices, some of them violent and criminal, that caused real harm to real people. The 1882 photograph of Jesse's body, taken shortly after his death, remains in museum collections. Looking at that photograph today, knowing what DNA testing later confirmed, provides a strange sense of closure. This was Jesse James, not the legend, not the myth, but the actual person, a man who'd lived violently and died young, who'd been simultaneously feared and celebrated, and whose death had been so convenient for some that many refused to believe it. The DNA testing also established important precedents for applying forensic science to historical questions. Following the Jesse James case, similar techniques were applied to other historical mysteries. Researchers exhumed and tested remains attributed to other famous outlaws, to disputed historical figures, and to victims of disasters whose identities had been lost. Each case built on the methodology developed for Jesse James, refining techniques and establishing standards for such investigations. The case demonstrated that DNA can persist in bones and teeth for centuries, making it the most reliable form of biological identification available. It showed that with proper techniques, meaningful results could be obtained even from severely degraded samples. And it proved that scientific evidence could definitively resolve historical controversies that had persisted for more than a century. For forensic science students, the Jesse James case is taught as a landmark example. The careful collection of samples, the extraction of mitochondrial DNA from century-old remains, the comparison with living descendants, the verification through multiple independent laboratories, all of this became a template for similar investigations. It's studied not just as a historical curiosity, but as an important case study in proper scientific procedure. Today, visitors to Kearney can see both the James Farm Museum and Jesse's grave. The grave is marked with a substantial headstone telling the basic facts of his life and death. There's no mention of the conspiracy theories or the DNA testing, just the dates and the simple acknowledgement that this is where Jesse James lies. In a way, that simplicity is appropriate. After all the controversy and investigation, after all the false claims and scientific testing, what remains is just a grave, a final resting place for a man who died young and violently in 1882. The story of Jesse James reveals America's complicated relationship with outlaws. We're fascinated by them, even romanticize them, while simultaneously condemning their crimes. We want them to be Robin Hood figures, stealing from the rich to give to the poor, when the reality is usually far more prosaic and far more violent. And sometimes we want them to be so clever that even death can't catch them, that they outsmart everyone and live to old age in secret. But the truth, as DNA testing proved, is often simpler than the legend. Jesse James died on April 3, 1882, shot by Bob Ford. He was buried at his family farm, later moved to Mount Olivet Cemetery. He didn't escape to live under an assumed name. He didn't fake his death. He simply died, as all people do. And the grave that bore his name for over a century really did contain his remains. Science provided that answer definitively, closing a mystery that had remained open for 113 years. It's a reminder that evidence eventually reveals truth. DNA doesn't lie. It doesn't care about legends or myths or what makes a better story. It simply is what it is, providing answers based on biological fact. The case of Jesse James stands as one of the most successful applications of forensic science to historical mystery, providing closure, confirming history, and demonstrating the power of modern technology to answer questions that once seemed permanently unanswerable. Jesse James died at 34, far too young by any measure. But he achieved a strange kind of immortality through living in memory and legend. The DNA testing didn't diminish that immortality. If anything, it secured it, ensuring future generations would know not just the legend, but the truth. And sometimes, knowing the truth makes the story even more powerful, because it reminds us that behind every legend was a real person who lived and died, who made choices that echoed through history, and who eventually found rest in a grave that science would one day confirm was exactly where it should be. Jesse James died in 1882, and he has rested in Kearney, Missouri ever since. The truth has won.